Thank you everyone for being here. I'm just going to launch right in here. Here we go. For those of you who were at last night's reception at MOA, you will have heard some of these words already. But in discussion of the wool weaving was installed at the Granville 70th Development Project in 2014, an installation that Deborah didn't mention. She said, quote, "I'm not going to stop weaving until I wrap the city of Vancouver in our work, because when you arrive here and come into the city, you should know that it is Salish territory and Musqueam." This vision has materialized over 2 decades at the Vancouver International Airport. For those of you who traveled through, you may have seen the weavings. The Museum of Anthropology, or as we call it, MOA, and now at the Granville Street Project. However, woven Salish blankets are not usually the first artworks that come to mind for Vancouverites, tourists, or art historians when they think of local art production. The idea of Northwest Coast native art as the indigenous cultural production of the region was historically framed rests upon visions of monumental totem poles, masks adorned with crest figures, and carved in the well-researched abstract formline design. But other styles and forms, including indigenous weaving practices on the coast, as we saw this morning through Megan O'Brien's work, have comparatively recently gained attention as art. How then have Salish wool weavings become public art at prominent locations in Vancouver? What is it that they are understood to represent to the traveler, the passerby, and the student in these public places? Local press releases and art blogs have noted the weaving installations, but a sustained critical discussion of their paradoxical wrapping of these colonial institutions and their infrastructure has not occurred in the discourse on textile art, on craft, and on indigenous art. This presentation will address how the presence of Salish wool weaving as public art has evaded this critical attention. In such a brief presentation, I can't adequately address the many Salish weavings that hang across this region, and there are many beautiful works. And this analysis, of course, cannot be generalized to all Salish weaving practices. The weavers that I have been fortunate to meet and to learn from are individual practitioners in a very diverse community. The ideas and experiences that they have shared in their texts, in their exhibitions, in interviews, presentations, and workshops are foregrounded here, in keeping with Indigenous feminist approaches. I cannot speak on their behalf. Briefly, my own scholarly practice as a descendant of settler families who came to Unceded territories in the mid-19th century, also known as Southern Ontario, Canada, I aim to sustain a critical awareness of the normalized structures of settler colonialism. I attend to the work of Carolyn Dean and of Melanie Herzog and Sarah Stolt in art history that call for scholarly conversations to challenge colonial constructs behind naturalized categories of art. Lastly, as an outsider to the weaving community, I expect I will make mistakes of protocol along the way. I aim to conduct my work in a respectful manner, and I welcome any corrections or to my errors or any omissions. So, to contextualize further, Musqueam scholar Jordan Wilson succinctly describes the territory in which these weavings installations are located. He says, "What is now referred to as the Greater Vancouver area in British Columbia is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam First Nation. Our main village and reserve is located at the mouth of the Fraser River, and the ancestors of present-day Musqueam people have lived in this estuary for thousands of years." End quote. Thor Carlson and Sonny McCulsey also attend to the history of the extensive social networks of Salish communities within the islands and the lands around the Salish Sea, so south down to Puget Sound, Seattle, east into the Fraser River Valley, and north up through the mountains to Whistler, BC, and regions. Practices of Salish weaving across the region are very ancient. Diverse plants and animal materials provided the warp and weft for woven objects, as has most recently been recounted by Leslie Tepper, Chief Janice George, and Willard Joseph in their 2017 publication, Salish Blankets. Due to changes to the region's flora and fauna, Through colonial settlement and urban development, much of this material is no longer available or readily accessible. And in Canada, the Federal Indian Act criminalized Indigenous cultural practices for over 60 years, severely disrupting knowledge sharing. But despite such systematic attempts at erasure, Salish weavers have persevered and innovated, producing a wide range of forms, styles, and garments, including public art installations. Academic research has documented the depth of these Salish weaving practices. It has categorized the objects in museum collections into styles and periods, and has documented Salish weaving as revivals across the region. Tepper, George, and Joseph incorporate the voices of contemporary weavers alongside in-depth investigations of historic blankets, as MOA has also done in past publications and in recent exhibitions of Salish weaving in the past year. However, a sustained discussion of the installation of contemporary Salish wool weavings in Vancouver as critically engaged public art has not yet occurred. Simply put, entwined modes of marginalization have played a role in forming the scholarly gap, as evidenced in the chapters and excerpts of the 2013 publication on the history of Northwest Coast Native art, edited by Charlotte Tanzingalt, Jennifer Kramer, and Kikayan. This field is a shifting construct, and historically one based on externally driven hierarchies and categorizations. These hierarchies devalued material culture that did not conform with certain form-line styles. There's excellent scholarship by Michael Q, Jim Q, Barbara Brotherton, for instance, that works with the nuanced and complicated aspects of Coast Salish material culture, and that also recognizes Salish art forms on their own terms. Weaving, of course, is metaphorically significant within Salish art practices, but the material object of weaving is still less frequently encountered in art galleries. Currently, an exception exists at the Belkin Gallery on UBC's campus, thanks to Jordan Wilson's curation of weavings from the Salish Weavers Guild. Additionally, Salish wool weaving techniques sit between technical categorizations used to argue for and against weaving practices as fine art in the fiber art debates of the 1960s and 70s. Alisa Auteur and Ty Smith have each addressed criteria that supported the position of certain textiles as craft or as fine art, including assumptions about the intellectual contents of weaving and gender biases that have surrounded textile art forms. Scholars such as Martine Reed and Evelyn Vanderhoek and Ruth Phillips have pointed to the struggles of Indigenous weavers to overcome gender biases and the conflation of Salish blankets with Euro-colonial concepts of textiles also positioned it as part of the domestic sphere. As addressed by Barbara Brotherton in Sub-Adept, The Gifts, the ways that Salish weaving practices were framed as craft in British Columbia overshadowed the social and political importance of this cultural material to Salish communities. Indeed, Indigenous scholar Doreen Jensen has also discussed how the social, spiritual, and emotional affect embedded in the material culture of the Pacific Northwest was overlooked through the decontextualizations of the material and formal hierarchies that shaped what could be considered as Northwest Coast Native art. What Jensen brings to light is consistent with what a number of Salish weavers have said when they describe their experience of attending to the emotional and affective aspects of their weaving practices. They have encountered weavings as effective entities that contain knowledge, memory, and protection. For instance, Susan Pabel's artwork, Sacred Change for Each Other, at the Seattle Art Gallery, is understood as a feminine entity. And Chief Janice George and Willard Joseph describe Salish blankets as, quote, merged objects, unquote, that continue to hold and foster rich social connections within, between, and beyond Salish communities. In the book, Hands of Our Ancestors, respected weavers Wendy Grant John and Barbara Caillou discuss their feelings as important components of weaving processes. And Deborah Sparrow has also attested to the role of attending to spirit as she and her colleagues grew in their knowledge of Salish weaving practices in the 1980s. So the effective capacity of Salish weaving is clearly evident to these weavers. Jumping to another thought here, but follow along with me. In her seminar at UBC in February 2017, Jessica Hennings discussed the, quote, interplay of textiles and politics, unquote. Hennings summarized that although the everydayness considered natural for textiles predisposes them to being overlooked, it also lends them the potential to, quote, move or communicate differently, end quote, than objects that attract greater attention. Are the assumptions made about Salish wool weaving that limit its legibility as critical artwork the same assumptions that have sanctioned it into this position as public art? A tentative argument can be launched with reference to local newspaper reporting. When interviewed in 2008 by Megan Stewart, the art consultant for the airport was clear that the airport avoided artworks that contained overt political statements so as not to confront or offend travelers. The weavings at the airport were installed roughly 22 years earlier in 1996 and may or may not have been considered in that way. The Musqueam Welcome area of the airport is home to 4 massive weavings entitled Out of the Silence. Woven by Musqueam weavers Krista Point, Robin Sparrow, Deborah Sparrow, Gina Grant, and Helen Calbraith, they are visible to international travelers arriving in Vancouver and juxtapose a massive carved wooden spindle whorl and house posts. The description of the weavings, so that's the first 2, and this is the second 2, and I took these photographs, so I apologize if they're not very clear. The description of the weavings on the airport's website highlights the endurance of this art form over millennia and its role in upholding Musqueam identity and community. In 2006, Charlotte Townsend Galt raised the critical potential of these weavings in this site, but left the question open for consideration. Travelers may or may not be aware that these entities perform an important and ongoing welcome gesture and protocol into unceded Musqueam territory. The next site I will consider is at the Museum of Anthropology, also located in unceded Musqueam territory, and many of you will have seen this last night if you were there. The Weaving 10 was created by Deborah Sparrow and Robin Sparrow in 1999 and was permanently installed in the Great Hall. It is described as addressing gender biases and material hierarchies of the museum's historic collections. And both Townsend Galt and Ruth Phillips have attended to this weaving's installation as a critical intervention into the space of the museum. 10's intricate patterns embody the complexity of Musqueam peoples. Its position in the Great Hall also directs attention to the long-term relationship the Musqueam First Nation and the museum have maintained with each other. It's this state of relationship that I want you to keep in mind as we go along here. The last installation to be addressed consists of 5 weavings located in a rectangular glass vitrine on the Granville Street facade of a mixed-use complex close to the Musqueam First Nation. The weavings here are visible day and night along this busy traffic corridor from the airport to downtown Vancouver. I don't know if any of you would have noticed them on your way by if you took that route or if you took some other route. I'm just going to move forward just so you get a quick look, but then I'll scroll back again. So the weavings are hung sort of in pairs by each weaver.
Which side of the street is it on?
It's on the west side of the street. And it sort of falls under, I didn't bring a photograph of it, but you can see this arch here.
It's the Safeway.
It's the what's called the Marpole Safeway, for those of you who know, because it's a redevelopment and it's got all kinds of interesting things going on in it. But I'm going to focus back here in my text. The accompanying artist statements of Krista Point, Robin Sparrow, and Deborah Sparrow speak to Musqueam's ancient and unceded territory, to losses encountered through colonial dispossession, of altered access to fish and mountain goat wool, of Musqueam's legacy of land claims, and the importance of family and social relations, language, culture, and shared spaces of urban existence. The brevity of their statements belies the breadth and depth of the complex history that they reference. Just giving you some close-ups that might be a little easier to see. Scholars such as Judith Ostrowitz have attended to the complex, quote, layering of many thought worlds, unquote, of Indigenous artists that create diverse readings for different audiences. Specific instances where the Musqueam community has resisted dispossession, where they've held vigil and thwarted development to protect their ancestral village and territory are documented by Musqueam on their website through the Cessnam City Before the City exhibitions and in the work of scholars such as Susan Roy, amongst others. But the visibility of these histories is still dependent upon the viewer's knowledge of and relationship with Musqueam. The Granville Street installation inspires an affective encounter. The eye-level vitrines do not command the viewer to look up, and reading the artist's words requires the viewer to stand in close proximity to each weaving. On the street and surrounded by vehicle and pedestrian traffic, the weavings shed the decontextualization of the art gallery spoken of by Doreen Jensen. Like the passerby, they are subjected to the elements, and despite concerns raised about their conservation, Deborah Sparrow is confident they are exactly where they should be. On the sidewalk, they become relatable entities encountered in the course of daily life. This is how I would propose the weavings create space for what scholars Sarah Hunt and Cindy Holmes call everyday decolonization. Hunt and Holmes' research, quote, acknowledges that Indigenous peoples' resistance to colonialism has unfolded in daily acts of embodying and living indigeneity, honoring long-standing relationships with the land and each other, end quote. They seek to understand, Hunt and Holmes seek to understand the quiet and relational processes of decolonization beyond the sphere of public protest and events of confrontation. So foregrounding lived experience, everyday life, social relations, emotional connections, presents these public art sites as non-confrontational modalities for decolonial praxis. Indeed, Musqueam author Lee Miracle's call to reincorporate, quote, female knowledge of conduct, end quote, may be materializing in these installations. If the idea of self-narration that Nancy Marie Mithlow has witnessed in her work with Indigenous women artists is applied, perhaps these weavings enact resistance to categorization rather than enduring marginalization. To paraphrase Hemmings and to uphold Sarah Hunt and Cindy Holmes' approach, a normalized view of political change as confrontation and struggle may overlook the potential of everyday life to sustain long-term and relational activities that have affected change within this unceded territory. To conclude with the terminology of George and Joseph and that of Mithlow, the Salish weavings at Granville Street, Moa, and the airport may be understood perhaps as merging the performance of public art with that of Salish protocols, conceptually re-narrating spaces of colonial dispossession into places that are, through the weavings, now legible as unceded territory. On a daily basis in public space, these artworks make visible a relational aspect of Musqueam protocol that operates prior to and beyond the now naturalized concepts of property and the litigious processes of land claims. In wrapping unceded territory, the weavings are more than signposts that tell the onlooker, you are here. Rather, they make the place the here that it is. The weavings and their weavers quietly assert Coast Salish presence, making visible the social relations they continue to embody. Thank you.